Subscribe to English Hub to achieve fluent English.
A Day in English Class: The Secret to Remembering Words. The Wednesday morning sun streamed through the tall windows of room 204, casting long rectangles of light across the wooden floors of Mrs. Anderson's English class. It was 9:15 a.m., and like every morning, 23 students from different corners of the world sat at their desks, eager to improve their English skills. The familiar scent of chalk dust and coffee lingered in the air. Mrs. Anderson never started her day without her large blue ceramic mug filled with Colombian brew. I had been attending these classes for 3 months now, and each day brought new discoveries about the English language. Mrs. Anderson, with her silver-streaked hair, always neatly tied back and reading glasses perched on the tip of her nose, had a special gift for making complex language concepts feel accessible. Her eyes would light up whenever a student asked a thoughtful question, and today would prove to be particularly illuminating. The morning began as usual with our daily warm-up routine. "Good morning, everyone." Mrs. Anderson's cheerful voice filled the room. "Let's start with our word of the day." She turned to write on the blackboard in her neat cursive handwriting. Serendipity. As she explained the meaning, the occurrence and development of events by chance in a happy or beneficial way, Sarah, a young woman from Brazil who sat 2 rows ahead of me, raised her hand. Sarah was known for her determination to master English. Her notebook was always filled with careful notes and colorful highlights. "Mrs. Anderson," Sarah began, her voice carrying a hint of frustration, "I have a question that's been bothering me for weeks. Every day we learn new words, and they're wonderful words, but—" She paused, searching for the right way to express herself. "I forget them so quickly. It's like they slip through my fingers like water. How can we better remember all these new words?" The classroom fell silent. Several students nodded in agreement. This was clearly a shared struggle. Even Ming, the usually quiet student from China who had the best vocabulary scores, looked up with interest. Mrs. Anderson placed her chalk down and smiled warmly. "That's an excellent question, Sarah. In fact, it's so important that I think we should dedicate today's lesson to it. Everyone, please move your desks into a circle. We're going to have a special session on the art of remembering words." There was a scraping of chairs and desks as we rearranged ourselves into a circle. Mrs. Anderson pulled her own chair into the formation, creating an intimate atmosphere that made it feel less like a classroom and more like a gathering of friends. "Now," she began, "learning words is like building a house. You need the right tools, the right materials, and most importantly, the right method. Let me share with you the techniques that have helped thousands of my students over the years." She stood up and walked to the whiteboard, dividing it into sections. "First, let's talk about why we forget words. Ahmed, why do you think you forget some words more easily than others?" Ahmed, a doctor from Egypt who was preparing for his medical licensing exam, adjusted his glasses thoughtfully. "Well, sometimes I learn words in isolation, just memorizing them from a list. But then I don't know how to use them in real situations." "Exactly!" Mrs. Anderson exclaimed. "That's the first key principle. Context is everything. Words are not meant to exist in isolation. They're meant to live in sentences, in stories, in real-life situations. She reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a stack of colorful index cards. Let me demonstrate. Yesterday, we learned the word meticulous. Instead of just memorizing, meticulous equals very careful about details. Let's create a memorable context. Mrs. Anderson then did something unexpected. She called up 3 students, Yuki from Japan, Carlos from Spain, and Lisa from Germany. We're going to create a mini story using this word. Each of you will add 1 sentence, but it must connect to the previous sentence and use our target word or relate to its meaning. Yuki started. The meticulous chef spent 3 hours decorating the wedding cake. Carlos added. Every rose petal was perfectly placed, and each swirl of frosting was measured precisely. Lisa concluded, his attention to detail paid off when the bride cried tears of joy upon seeing his masterpiece. Beautiful! Mrs. Anderson clapped her hands. Now everyone close your eyes. Can you see the cake? The chef working carefully? The bride's reaction? This is how words stick in our memory, through vivid associations and emotional connections. The class was fully engaged now, and Mrs. Anderson continued with more practical techniques. She pulled out various props from her teaching treasure box, as she called it, a small chest she kept filled with teaching materials. Here's another powerful technique. Word families, she explained, drawing a tree on the board. Let's take the word happy as the trunk of our tree. She began adding branches. Happiness, unhappy, happily, happiest. By learning words in families, you create a network in your brain. Each connection makes the word stronger in your memory. Gabriella, can you add another branch to our happy tree? Gabriella, a talented artist from Colombia, suggested happiness-seeking, which led to a discussion about compound words and word formation. As the lesson progressed, Mrs. Anderson shared more techniques. 1. The personal connection method. She had us write sentences using new words to describe our own lives and experiences. 2. The visualization technique. For concrete nouns, she encouraged us to draw simple sketches next to the words. Even if we weren't artists, the act of drawing helped cement the word in our memory. 3. The story chain. We created ongoing stories as a class, each student adding a sentence using a target word from our vocabulary list. The etymology exploration. She showed us how understanding word origins could help us remember meanings, like how autobiography breaks down into auto, self, bio, life, and graphy, writing. 5. The sensory association. For each new word, we tried to associate it with a sound, smell, taste, texture, or image. As the class progressed, something magical happened. Students began sharing their own experiences and techniques. Fatima from Morocco explained how she created songs with new words. Paulo from Brazil demonstrated his method of creating mind maps for word families. Even Shai Ming shared how he used smartphone apps to practice vocabulary during his daily commute. Mrs. Anderson watched with evident satisfaction as the classroom transformed into a laboratory of language learning. She added another dimension to our understanding by explaining the science behind memory and learning. Your brain, she explained, love's patterns, emotions, and connections. When you learn a word, you're not just memorizing a combination of letters. You're creating a neural network of associations. The richer these associations are, the stronger your memory of the word will be. To demonstrate this, she introduced a game. She wrote 10 new words on the board and gave us 5 minutes to create a short story using all of them. The catch? The story had to be either extremely funny, sad, or scary, engaging our emotions to help cement the words in our memory. The resulting stories had the entire class laughing and gasping. Who could forget the word cacophony after hearing Carlos's tale about a tone-deaf opera singer performing for an audience of music critics, or ephemeral after Yuki's touching story about a cherry blossom festival? As our special session drew to a close, Sarah, who had asked the initial question, was beaming. I never realized learning words could be so alive, she said, gesturing at her notebook, now filled with colorful diagrams, story snippets, and word families. Mrs. Anderson nodded approvingly. Words are alive, Sarah. They're not just entries in a dictionary. They're tools for expression, windows to new ideas, bridges between people. The key to remembering them is to welcome them into your life, not just your vocabulary list. Before the bell rang, Mrs. Anderson gave us a special homework assignment. We were to choose 5 words we had been struggling to remember and use all the techniques we had learned to make them unforgettable. We would share our results the next day. As we packed up our bags, there was an energetic buzz in the room. The frustration that had been evident in Sarah's initial question had transformed into excitement about trying these new approaches. Students were already forming study groups to practice together, sharing their favorite techniques and planning how they would tackle their vocabulary learning differently from now on. Walking out of room 204 that Wednesday, I realized that Mrs. Anderson had given us much more than techniques for remembering words. She had shown us how to make the learning process itself memorable, engaging, and personal. The sun was still streaming through the windows, but now it seemed to illuminate not just the classroom, but also the path forward in our language learning journey. In the days that followed, we all noticed a difference. Words weren't just fleeting visitors in our minds anymore. They had become dear friends, each with its own story, its own connections, its own place in our expanding English universe. And it all started with one student's question on a sunny Wednesday morning in Mrs. Anderson's class.